Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Media Roundtable, a special edition. And as we always say, this is a show where we dive into the secrets of the craft of audio advertising and where we seek to provide our perspective on industry topics in service of the marketers that we work with and who are responsible for all sorts of different marketing programs, but above all, audio programs. And to coin the phrase, we want to do this in service of folks that we've now politely called chief audio officers, or indeed those folks who are responsible for budgets that fall into the various different platforms of audio. I'm your host today. I'm Steve Abraham. I'm delighted to be here. I believe this is the first time that I've actually hosted one of these shows. It may be the last, depending on how the next 60 minutes go. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to cover what, for me, is one of a very broad topic. As you know, on this roundtable, we tend to dive deep into a lot of industry topics along the lines of obviously deep into media, into messaging, into measurement, often very tactical areas of the business, and we get really into the minutiae, as I've said. This week, we're going to take a slight step back. Over the past number of months, we've been hearing more and more from the different marketeers that we work with, and indeed industry folks, the much more sort of broader question that arises when we talk about audio, obviously with the advent of the space and sort of all of the developments that have taken place over the past 3 or 4 years. The big question that is perennially arising is, what is the core role of audio in a marketeer's broad, marketing system in the mix of their communications? So, is it primarily brand oriented? Is it performance? Is it a hybrid? What's the core contribution that audio is actually giving to that marketing mix? And, with the changes, as I've said, in the audio industry these past few years, the digitization of the platforms and the roller coaster that has been podcast, I think it's a topic that's very close to all of our hearts and all of our clients' budgets. And so today I'm delighted to have with me a number of guests, some of which you know, and a couple of which have not actually been on the show, but I'm delighted to have joined us. So firstly, hello to Neal and Miranda, regulars from Oxford Road. How are you guys this morning?
Fantastic. Happy to be here.
It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Well, as I said, you two are often here, but in addition to both Neal and Miranda, I'm delighted to introduce two folks who I've had the pleasure of working with, have known for many, many years. Chris Binns, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of the WPP agency OpenX. For those of you that know Chris, he needs no introduction. He and I have worked together for a long time. One of the, I would say, smartest and most brilliant strategists I know, and I'm delighted you took the time to join us today, Chris. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. In addition, I'm equally as delighted to introduce Andrea Stillacci. Andrea is somebody also I've known for many, many years, who I consider an amazing creative director in the industry and a friend. Also a WPP alum back in the day, was leading the creative operations of JWT and various different shops within the group, I believe I'm correct in saying, Andrea, and who is now the founder of the French independent agency based in Paris called Herezie, which is I'm not even going to list all of the awards and commendations that Herezie have had over the past few years, but congratulations on all the success you've had. And again, delighted that you've taken the time to join us. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Steve. Absolutely.
So with that, let's get straight into it. If I may, Chris, I'm going to turn this question to you. You're in the hot spot, so I'm going to pose this question first to you. When we talk about sort of multi-channel imperatives in media today, and all of the different things that audio now represents, how have you seen audio as being a potential opportunity within everything that you're putting together with strategies for your clients? In short, I'm just going to get straight to the point. Does audio even rise up in the conversation early on in strategy developments when you're talking to your clients? And if so, in what context, and how important is it at the moment?
Well, I think my view is that thinking about individual channels and describing them in certain ways is perhaps unhelpful in the development of strategy. So if you think about what people want out of the world, our old definitions of media have ceased to be useful probably around 1999, but we're still using them, right? social, digital, TV, radio, audio, and. It's much more useful, I think, in the strategic construct to think about the context of the world around you, what's going on, and therefore what are the spaces in which you can create some kind of competitive advantage, disruption, opportunity for your brand. And I think when I think like that, I think the world is increasingly dominated by 6 or 7 magnificent black holes, that have this ridiculous gravitational pull on people's entire worlds. And I think when you look at the advice that people were giving about those black holes, even 10 years ago, it was everyone's doing stuff with the audio turned off. You don't need audio anymore. And I think the world has flipped. That world has flipped. And I think it's very interesting. And I think it's flipped for 2 reasons, right? Reason number one is predominantly sensorial and emotional. You have to understand that people go to things for emotional reasons. Right. And so if someone wants entertaining, or they want some light-hearted humor, or they want some uplifting music, or they want to they want to go deep on a topic in a podcast, then they're going to go to a certain space for that stuff. So at one level, you've got the sort of sensorial and emotional driver. At the other level, you've got this thing that people keep on overlooking whenever you talk about audio, which I find fascinating. COVID's made people spend hundreds of dollars on headphones. And post that point, audio changed, and audio's role in people's worlds changed, because when you spend hundreds of dollars on a pair of headphones, you kind of want to use them.
Yeah, you're going to be listening to stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then in that world, you sort of need to think about the difference between. It's interesting that you talked earlier about the different things you cover on the podcast, right? You sort of need to extract yourself from the tactical and the transactional, and start to think about media in a different way and audio in a different way. And if you think about it from the perspective of, can I reach people? Yeah, you can reach people. You can reach people anywhere, right? You just think about it on the basis of, can I create magic? And is there an opportunity here? And you start to ask some very different questions. And I think that's where I think the conversation can and should and needs to go. Has it gone there? Not necessarily all the time with everybody, but media is not maths, and anyone who's looking at media from a mathematical perspective is going to end up with the wrong answer and no competitive advantage. Media is human behavior. And the second you understand it like that, and you understand why people are going to do what they're going to do on the variety of platforms on which audio exists and what the drivers of that are, then there's opportunity there.
Well said. I think that's an interesting perspective. That's going to jump around some of the questions, because I think that opens up something very close to your heart, Andrea, regarding, from that perspective that Chris has mentioned, regarding sort of creative strategy. Are there areas that Chris has talked about, or areas that you've seen with clients that you're working with, that are now resonating more into the kind of choices you're making in terms of how creative is going to be developed, and whether or not audio plays a more important role in the development of creative? And I cite some of the work that you've done recently with regards to the Inequality Observatory, which I think is fascinating work that Herizie's done. Is there anything you're saying as within the conversations you're having with the brands that you deal with?
Well, I first of all, I fully agree with Chris when he says just our world is related to human behavior, and media is nothing if we don't put the spotlight on human behavior and we respect it and we observe it. And that is why I don't have a one single answer, because the way we look at things is like we take different shapes, like water takes from the glasses. And Amazon Prime Video, for example, when you have a client like that, audio is part of the key, because it's a huge arrow of their entertainment arch, and it's part of the cinema. Look just at the debate on the audio with artificial intelligence in Hollywood, with the dubbing, with the music, and that is why the recent work we did was to underline the importance of audio. And that's why for audio we call not just music, we call dubbing, special effect, and we have created content out of that type of interaction. And or sometimes it's not in the brief, Sometimes the brief has nothing to do with the audio, and you say, well, that's great. Audio could be an analogy. Audio could be, a way to tell a story. And the reason why the radio that you light is an audio trick, an audio device that we put together to make people think about how inequalities in society can filter opportunities to people according to their social origins, and just trim and trim and trim and trim and trim. And that's why we use the radio and the multiple voices to create that. But that is an idea that came out, and there was not the audio in the brief. There was just how can we communicate inequalities in French society, and the creatives came out with an audio-driven idea. So there is not a rule. I think it really depends on the kind of window you want to use to enter into people's mind. But it's what really I noticed. There are two things that really struck me. One is, I don't know, guys, if you heard the Depeche Mode track made by artificial intelligence that came out a week ago, and this is not just goosebumps. That is a shock. That is a tsunami of perfection, and no human being touched that track. It blew me away, and then. Thanks to TikTok and the social, I'm amazed by the juxtapositions. I mean, we were not used for such a level of multiple juxtaposition between images and sounds. In the old days, you had radio, I go to a gig, I put on a record, I have my headphones, I enjoy, maybe I hear some noises down in the street, but the multiple connection between Vivaldi and in the time of a scroll, you can find the audio trends, and the audio trends applied to visual playgrounds that have nothing to do between each other, and they can create and sparkle in your mind inspiration or emotions, or just something that you never felt before when you talk about that specific topic. For me, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that audio has never been so fast in reaching people and spreading with a completely new language.
And as we often say on a sister podcast that we have, that our creative director puts together called Ad Infinitum, audio has a much quicker response versus visual. I think it's half the time that you can get the sensory experience in audio than you can in visual. So I think that's very, very, very interesting. You said something really interesting when you were speaking, Andrea, which was it wasn't in the brief, right? And I think this is the heart of something that we're sort of getting to, which is audio in many instances is kind of an afterthought, right? How many times have we all been in pitches where the guys have said, oh, we should probably write a quick audio script as well for if they come in and they want to do something. Is this something you're still seeing with clients who kind of consider it an afterthought, or do you think, even though it wasn't in the brief, Andrea, how responsive was the client when you put this together, and is it now something that's higher up on their agenda as we move forward?
I think the good news about this change that surrounds us is that it triggers curiosity into the advertisers, we tend to work with people that don't have pre-cooked thoughts, and they are open for innovation. They are open for different ways of looking at things, but the starting point still, it's really, we are obsessed, like Chris is. Our work could be extremely simple, when you just free your screen, your mental screen, from all the artificial architecture that surround the marketing world, and you go straight on the bridge with people. And again, it's all about people, and audio is probably the trickiest expression of art, because audio is the most vulnerable one. If you go to see a movie, a long Eastern Europe arty movie of 3 hours, you can get bored, but you say, okay, it's fine. if you read Finnegan's Wake or Joyce, you go through it. You know, it's an effort. It's an investment. When it's about music, and you go to Pierre Boulez, you go to Stockhausen, you go to expression or dodecaphony, that hurts. That hurts. And people has the level of patience to accept avant-garde in audio is much, much lower than any of the other senses. And I think that is why, because human beings are much more sensitive on the audio. It affects. And that's why when it goes on the positive side, it goes really deep under the skin and works extremely well, and it's powerful because we react very strongly to audio inputs.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and I'm going to pose this to the group. I mean, that leads me on to the next question. In terms of the sonic branding discussion, what advice can you bring to give to clients who are sort of considering it, who perhaps only ever really worked in the visual space, and how do you start those conversations, and what are the trigger points to get them to move into it? Because we all know the power of it.
I think, I mean, look, for me, it starts with a really simple observation, which is pretty much nobody cares about any advertising that they get exposed to whatsoever. And so you need to make it ridiculously easy for people to pay attention, to engage, to listen, to enjoy, to be challenged by it, to Andrea's point, right? And in order to do that, you do need fluid devices that are going to work as a connective tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that increasingly there are a variety of different spaces that are not just visual, but they are visual and aural, or they are just aural, which is really interesting. I think that point about audio being the most challenging of the senses and the arts in an avant-garde space is a really well-made point. It's very hard to, it's very easy to do it very badly, right? And it's very hard to do it very well. And that, you know, I mean, you can at some level go back to some of the classics. Intel Inside. I mean, honestly, it's genius, right? It's absolute genius. And I don't know what it is. It's 3 notes or something, isn't it? 3 or 4 notes.
4 notes, yeah.
And so for me, that conversation is starting to come back as connective tissue of aural branding, which I think is very interesting.
Do you think it was lost for a while?
Yeah, I think it was lost for a while, partially because people were told that everyone was consuming social media with the sound turned off, which to a degree was correct, but that has changed, right? I think TikTok, to a degree, YouTube. I mean, people underestimate YouTube, right? TikTok and YouTube have changed that quite fundamentally, I think. But I also think, you know, there's a really interesting point about the world around us, which is a visual overload. The world around us is visually overloaded because of honestly, at some level, because of the revenue model of the defining apps of this generation, right? They have to lay a visual revenue into their constructs, which means that people spent a lot of time focusing on how to win in a visually overloaded world. And instead of asking a question, well, maybe we can win in a different world, which I think is back to Andrea's point about if you can make something avant-garde in that world that cuts through, then you just you're changing the game.
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually, because I want to ask Andrea his thoughts. And Chris, it kind of goes back to your point of during COVID, all of a sudden people are spending hundreds of dollars on headphones, right? And I actually, because we had a pre-meeting and I looked it up, like I looked at Statista data and it like clearly shows, and it actually happened a little bit before COVID when the Apple decided not to include headphones any longer with their devices. But I mean, how like now audio is so personal because it's on your ear or it's in your ear. How does that affect kind of how you approach audio from a creative perspective, or does it?
I think that the main point for me for audio, I would separate the technical point that is the quality of the sound, the noise reduction system, how people can have and interact more with sound with high quality from the conceptual one. And what really drives my interest is the conceptual one. It's where an audio and but even the soundtrack out of the awards. I love the awards on Audiocraft because Audiocraft a bit more than edit or color, because Audiocraft, you can really be avant-garde. I mean, remember the perfection, and you can play every single inch and second of Guinness Surfers, and the audio craft and the depth of Guinness Surfers. It was not just a soundtrack; it was a whole world made by several layers of emotions, and that for me, it's perfection. When you manage to create and handle audio from a conceptual point of view, and you have such a big palette at your service of things that you can do, and that's magic. And that is why the conceptual part of and that's why I go always back to the avant-garde, always from these guys that in the 50s were just injecting concept and mathematics and architecture into musical scores, and trying to turn them into something different. And nowadays the technology is going in that direction. It's injecting, they're playing, and as Chris said, of course, it's not the time of anymore. Okay, digital and social, they have the volume out. No, it's the opposite, and really makes you, when you scroll on TikTok or whatever, very often is the audio that stops you, because it gives you a key of reading the image that really grabs your attention, completely unexpected. And that's why I think it's a very, very interesting moment for using music as concept and not just entertainment.
Obviously, we've gone conceptually into all sorts of different wormholes and black holes on this. I just want to bring it back a little bit, nonetheless, however interesting these areas are. At the recent Heard conference, Mark Ritson was heard emphasizing audio's pivotal role as the ultimate sidekick in marketing. I think he cited that audio, while only sometimes taking the spotlight, yields significant impact with what is actually very small budgets. And I'm going to merge this question into another one to bring it back to more of a more media aspect. And I'm going to pose this to you, Miranda. We've seen for many, many years that, audio represents anywhere between 20 to 25, if not even 30% of time spent in terms of consuming messages and media, yet is representing around the world 5 or 6% of marketeers' budgets, right? We get some of the broader arguments around, well, it is only one sense versus being multi-sensory. But what is it that you think is perhaps preventing audio from getting a higher share of the dollars that are being deployed broadly across platforms? And after your answer, I'd love to get your perspectives, Chris and Andrea and Neal as well, on this question, which is kind of the crux of it, because it does always boil down to choices and dollars.
So I think there are a couple of reasons. And Chris, actually, you said it, right? So people spend a lot of time figuring out how to win in a visually overloaded world. And so I think that has limited marketers' perspectives, especially brands that have traditionally relied on image. But I hate to do this, but I'm going to kind of bring it back down to like the actual execution, because I'm living it, I'm breathing it every day, and can definitely speak to some of the challenges. And I think the real fundamental challenge, particularly in audio and podcasts, is just simply the lack of standardization and the absence of a reliable and universal metric system. It makes it very difficult to have a clear understanding of listenership, right? Not just numbers, but like who is actually listening. Just to put it in perspective, podcast hosting platforms, and there are many, they vary in the data that they provide, how they count downloads, which creates a lot of inconsistency in reporting. Some hosting platforms don't even have the capability to tell you whether or not someone heard your ad. So it makes it very complicated, and I think to make matters somewhat more challenging is the terminology isn't even standardized, right? So downloads, impressions, listens, it's all used interchangeably, which creates a lot of friction between the buyers and the sellers. And quite frankly, that lack of transparency leaves the audio industry vulnerable to fraud, manipulation of the numbers. And I think another reason is it's a maturing medium, right? So things are constantly in flux, constantly changing. And then you add on top of it just the sheer volume of players and all of the fragmentation. I think it makes it very difficult for new people to kind of come into the industry and set up successful campaigns.
Very well said. Chris, is that anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that I think there's a very fair point made about standardization there, right? There's a lack of standardization will undermine anything at some level, especially when you're trying to scale it, right? But the way that I would think about it is that undoubtedly needs solving, right? But it's like the difference between, well, that's a maths question, right? And I think that the more interesting question is either a physics or a time question. And if I'm understanding, I'm not a Greek historian, but if I'm understanding my Greek gods correctly, there were 3 different Greek gods of time: Chronos, Kairos, and Eros. And Eros was about eras, and we kind of know what era we're in, the mobile phone, if you're going McLuhan-esque on it. Chronos is old father time, right? Weights and measures. That's the maths of a medium.
I've got a PlayStation, Chris. I know who Kronos is.
And I don't think weights and measures is particularly interesting. I think it's back to what Andrea was saying. The interesting thing is Kairos, which is moments and opportunity and magic. And I think the reality is that if you've got a really clear, this comes down to the brief, right? To your earlier question about the brief, the best brief is a problem and an insight and nothing else, right? What's the problem? What's the insight? Let's develop an idea that solves that thing, rather than here's some stuff that we've got that we need to distribute across some channels. If your question is here's some stuff, how do we distribute it? Then you've boiled it down into maths. And if you're playing a maths game, then there's no competitive advantage. There's only competitive advantage in insight-driven idea design, that then in some instances, it could be that audio, it should be 95% of that spend.
Absolutely.
In other instances, it should be maybe be 0. There's classic examples historically of I remember Gordon's and tonic, gin and tonic. The smell of gin and tonic was piped into cinemas in the UK years ago. Blank screen, the smell of gin and tonic. The same principle applies in audio, right? But you've just got to be clear on what the question is. If the question's maths, then until you're standardized, you're never going to win.
And I think, Chris, to your point, I just want to say, I completely agree. I think the magic, the importance of audio has outweighed its limitations. It's how we built the agency.
Yeah.
But then you also said it, right? Like without that accountability and transparency, it's very hard to scale.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I should jump in. Our clients now are so held to short-term results and held to their management, I think, to what they can measure and how they can measure it. And so it forces you into certain channels. And even in audio, like radio probably doesn't get its fair share anymore. I mean, listenership is declining over time. It's a slowly melting ice cube, as we've said. But there isn't really a great measure for radio other than reach and frequency. And clients don't want to use that. They want to use how many visits did I get? How many conversions did I get? So that creates a problem for that particular aspect of audio, which is still to a large degree, the biggest part of the audio industry. The other thing is I get torn about the disconnect between time spent and the amount of money that goes into audio, because I don't think that marketers are necessarily making their investments based on time spent. I think they're making their investments on where they can make the most impact. But I do think we should raise it because there is a disconnect, even though I'm torn about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. But also, you know, we all know that the slice of the pie of spending in audio is not necessarily growing at the same rate. But the dollars are shifting between platforms. I mean, we've seen in just the past 2 or 3 years, podcast growing from sub 0.5% of all advertising to potentially even being, you know, in the next 3 or 4 years, or could even be 1.5 to 2%. Now, it's still very small in the grand scheme of things, but that's an exponential growth. And we've seen the number of shows that have come out. International is now hockey sticking versus the US, and the environment that you can actually reach people in podcasts is so much more qualitative because of the engagement levels, which we've talked about on many shows. I guess the scalability is going to come over time. Do you think the reach question is going to enter more in there now that we've seen in a recent report, you know, that you can reach almost 50% of adults in the US through podcasts across a month period? Do you think that's going to change in terms of how clients are thinking about subdividing those dollars? Neal, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I have a perspective on this because I think a lot of the audio industry to some extent, I think, is doing itself a disservice because they're conflating listenership with the ability to deliver a reach number. So 50% of adults 18 to 34 are listening to podcasts, but I can't reach that many. I mean, how many thousands and thousands of podcasts would I have to actually buy to achieve that reach? So I do worry about that because to the same degree in radio, we're saying, oh, radio has higher reach now than television. Yes, in theory it does. There's higher listenership now to radio than there is to television. But I know I can't get much. I know I can achieve a greater reach in television versus radio. I know I can.
Well, perhaps it brings back to what Chris and Andrea were talking about. It's not necessarily a math game, right? We know we can get large numbers through broader platforms, but the quality element that audio can overlay is going to be more successful in kind of hopefully stimulating those behaviors in consumers to make a difference because they're engaged in a different way. We always liken podcasts to the closest equivalent of word of mouth that there is out there in terms of being a paid media environment, and perhaps that's the aspect that's triggering its success.
I mean, I think that, I mean, this dates me, but when I first started in this industry, I mean, it was mostly television, sprinkling on some print, and then print got replaced by digital, et cetera, right? But way back when, we would actually apply, factors to television day parts based on attention. So we would consider that prime time had much higher attention rates than early morning. And I don't think we're there, that same kind of level of discipline, I think, has been lost. We're just looking at reach without considering the attention or, the value of the impression behind that reach. So I think that's something the industry has to figure out. I mean, I'll argue that a podcast impression is much more valuable than a radio impression because, people are like leaned into listening to a podcast. They're spending 45 minutes, an hour, whatever. The host is engaged with the products that they're selling. So, we've got to try to factor that into the equation at some point. So I think it's something that is a challenge right now in terms of valuing that not all impressions are created equally, and we need to put greater value on the impressions that are going to do more for driving business.
So with that, and kind of bringing it around to the beginning of what we were talking about in this podcast and the general role of audio, do you think clients' ears are pricking up more, Chris and Andrea, with regards to the importance of the platform? And as you're working on briefs for your clients, do you think they're more open, or is it more of an, I take it back to a previous question, is it still an afterthought, or do you think over the next few years we're going to see an even newer and reinvigorated revolution into how clients think about spending their dollars in audio?
I mean, look, from my perspective, I think audio is more of a conversation. I think that's true. I think the if I was to boil it down into the podcast element of that conversation, because I think Andrea made some very good points about audio in some differing environments earlier, which I think is fundamentally important to the overall health of the ecosystem, actually. Honestly, I think the thing that will solve it is when there's better work in the environment.
Yeah.
I think there's some very mediocre work that gets delivered through podcast as a medium. And that is not helping some of that conversation.
Well, let me ask you a question then, because the work is often defined by the task. Do you feel that podcast leans more? This is an existential question, but do you think it's a brand play or a performance play? And one can always say it's a hybrid of the two, but where do you sit on that?
It's not a hybrid thing. It's more a question of understanding that you've got a problem and you've got a way of solving that problem. And depending on the way of solving that problem will depend on the role for the thing within the overall construct. I mean, look, at some profound B2B level, I still fundamentally believe somebody in a B2B environment could win in podcasting. There is a huge opportunity for someone to nail that environment, probably more than one brand, to be perfectly honest. And I don't know who it would be, and I don't know what it would look like, but you know, there's something in there that could be really cool and interesting. I think at the other end of the spectrum, you get a lot of very transient, pretty poorly scripted and thought through work that is undermining the perceived quality of the environment.
I agree. That is what I like about the exchange we're having is that we go back to not only what is the role of the media, but do we have something interesting to say to people, and do we do that in the best possible way? So it's show me how good you are. You know, I'm there. You're a brand. Show me how good you are. Show me how good you are in understand me, in giving a simple message. And the role of audio. I mean, you are media guys, and I think that audience is a pretty important word for you. And audience come from Latin, and it's a word that comes from audientum, and it doesn't come from visio, it comes from audio, audientum, that is the present participle of audire. So the word audience comes from audio.
Yeah,
that's the origin. That's from the Latins, and now it became an audience of everything, audience of a movie, audience of whatever. But the origin of the word is audio.
yeah.
And that is why I think it's interesting to put back the audio at the center of where it was. And but you have to do it properly. It's not about an algorithm or mathematics. I mean, Netflix, when it does to-doom, the to-doom of Netflix, you feel great at home. You know, you're there with your blanket, you're tired, and you hear to-doom. You feel better. Maybe the film is shit, the series is bad, sorry for the word, but you feel great, you know, to doom. And that is what is fascinating. And as Chris was saying, there are huge opportunities but you really have to walk the talk and not just talk about audio. What do you do with that? And how you twist it, how you can create something new. And in content, in podcasts, in the way you tell the stories. There are podcasts in Italy that are huge, and it's just about crime novels and crime, but the way it's been brought to life, it's good, it's perfect. You don't need the visual, it's so perfectly done. So I mean, let's put audio back into audience. I mean, that is that is a kind of a cheap line, but I think that there is quite a lot behind that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating perspective to look at it, and you kind of brought everything full circle. I mean, or arguably, radio was the first big broadcast medium, gone through tumultuous history, and we're coming back out the other side with a new revolution. And I think, just to summarize a few things that you've said there, we've gone into some pretty interesting areas, talked about sonic branding, talked about the difference between how much consumers listen to and how much marketeers spend. If we were to sort of just wrap this up, what would be a couple of words? Well, two things I'm going to pose both to Chris and Andrea, and it's just a couple of questions to finish this off, and I'll hear from Neal and Miranda as well. What would be a final piece of advice that you would pose to some of the clients who are first thinking about going into audio? And then what's a couple of recent podcasts that you've listened to that you could thoroughly recommend for anybody out here? Even though most of the people who listen to this show are deeply entrenched in podcast, I'm always fascinated to hear what people are listening to.
In terms of I'm Italian, and one podcast, and of course is about crime scenes, and what drives me is when they mix sound design and stories, when they create depth about the listening experience. That is why I remember, Chris, there was a campaign, they won a Grand Prix from the New York Times that was by another, it was Droga 5 or something, that it was just about graphic and sounds, and it was telling that, you remember, it was a Grand Prix, and it was just about the efforts the journalists do, and it was like a truth is worth it, something like that. And in terms of sound and audio, it was a great, amazing example. So if I have to just an advice is just make an effort and go beyond the surface. I mean, they a lot of advertisers and clients, they tend to swim, and sometimes they should dive. And because well, because when you swim, yeah, it's easy to swim, and you make it's good for your body, and but when you dive, you discover, and that is I think that is the advice for me, even in the audio world. Don't just swim, just dive, and ask to your agency to dive, ask to your creatives to dive, and they will come out with pretty beautiful pearls.
You gonna top that, Chris?
No one can top that, can they? But
but it's just common sense, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely analogy though. Look, I think the advice I would give is it's all about human behavior. To steal from Björk, and I think that for me, it's just that simple. Understand what human beings are doing, what they're up to, and our job is to move them. It's to move them from one place to another place. Actually, predominantly in order for commercial benefit at some level, right? Generally, the vast majority of what the advertising industry does is commerce. Some of it is higher order, but the vast majority is commerce. And I think that if you just stick by that, then you'll be in a pretty good place. I think, and if you want podcast recommendations, I mean, so there's an amazing woman called Professor Hannah Fry, who has a BBC podcast called Uncharted, which talks about all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff, happiness, aging, all of those kind of things. I'm kind of into weird exploratory things. I would say I mean, broadly, the only two that I listen to are hers and the FT Daily News podcast.
Need Chris. Brilliant. Neal, Miranda, have you got anything else to add to that as we begin to wrap up this show?
Uh, I'm not going to top either of those, but what I would say is I think there's a good reminder that I think we're often thinking from marketer to consumer, and we need to reverse it and think consumer to marketer, like and the fact, like Chris brought it up, like the explosion of headphone sales that occurred during COVID. How are we engaging with the channel? How does that inform the creative? If you're listening to your audio predominantly through a headphone that's a high-end headphone, does that give you more creative leeway, right? You can improve your messaging. So I think that that's a really good reminder for us. And by and large, if you're not in your car, you're listening to audio through your mobile device, right? Or it's your companion at work. And the one thing I would say is I have found that audio is my companion for work. I've tried to listen to podcasts when I've been working. It's been a disaster. I don't get anything done because I have to devote too much my attention to it. But I can always have a soundtrack as my companion, and I can be effective. Like, I need to get in the zone. So it's like I've got my headphones on and I'm listening to music and I'm working, and I can be focused.
Excellent.
And I think one thing that I'll just say is, like, audio, it's intentional, it's intimate. It creates a lot of opportunity for advertisers to engage on a deeper level. You know, you listen to it when you want, where you want, with who you want, doing whatever you want. And so there's a lot of different moments in that to sort of maximize. So, you know, I would say just take your time and be intentional with the creative. I was getting acupuncture last weekend and I'm sitting there and they're playing spa music and I don't know what platform it was on, but then all of a sudden it was like an ad for fentanyl. It was like beware, and it was incredibly disruptive. And I was just thinking, like, what a missed opportunity, right? Like, just as how disturbing that was to me as I'm sitting there trying to relax, like it could have been a moment for an advertiser to really capture that. And so just be intentional, especially with the creative and with who you're trying to reach.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I found that last 60 minutes to be fascinating. We covered a plethora of topics, all rooted in the core question of what is the role of audio in marketers' ecosystem and mix of communication channels. For those of you who are listening, who are responsible for audio budgets or considering the medium, based on the illustrious panel that we've had today, as you're thinking broadly about how you enter into it, you know, be intentional about what you're doing in creative, and understanding how you're deploying your dollars. You can get an enormous amount of value from the audio mediums. It shouldn't just be an afterthought. And to quote eloquently, or to be as eloquent as Andrea had said, you don't need to just dip your toe. It's not expensive. You can get huge value. Dive for those pearls, and we're confident that you'll find the kind of value that you expect out of deploying the dollars into the audio platforms. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining the Media Roundtable this week. I think it's been a fascinating conversation with an eclectic and exciting mix of guests. And just to sort of say, this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road. You know, we want you to succeed in audio. We want you to use influence for good with the audiences you reach. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance these voices that don't just entertain, but actually edify and can consolidate what it is you're doing. We want to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of the age. And this is the place where you can find that conversation. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to the agency Oxford Road by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. We have a whole host of different other media environments that you can listen to. I want to give a shout out to Stu Redwine, who hosts our sister show Ad Infinitum. It's a wonderful environment for you to listen to learn all about the various different creative opportunities and the creative discussions that are going on place within the audio world. So with that, I want to thank our illustrious guests this week. Thank you, Neal. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Andrea, CEO and founder of Herezie. And thank you, Chris, from OpenX. We value all of the insight and information that you've brought to this show. You've made it a wonderful conversation. And as a final piece, I just want to give a shout out to a specific passion project for Andrea that we've talked about. It's called The Intrusion Project, and you can find it at theintrusionproject.com. I'm not going to go too deep into it. I would encourage you all to go and take a listen, but suffice to say, it is an amazing documented piece of history around some events that took place in Italy in the 70s with regards to the broadcast industry. A fascinating project I would encourage all of you to take a look at. Thank you for that, Andrea, and thank you for all of you for listening. Looking forward to the next show, and arrivederci.